back to the Awakening Philosophy podcast. My name is Jed, and we are reading Plato's Phaedo to discover what exactly philosophy is and how do we do it properly. So far, we have covered the introduction. We've covered a few opening statements with Socrates. He gave us a real puzzle. He said if you're doing philosophy right, then you're doing your life's work. If you do so, you will have developed the virtues. Sophrosune. Sophrosune meaning temperance, but it's also used to refer to all of the virtues because sophrosune is the correct ordering of all of the parts of your soul according to their virtues. And if you have done it well, if you have done your life's work well, not only will you have the virtues, you will have recognized why it's important to follow Socrates where he's going as quickly as you can. What the hell does that mean? Because Socrates is about to be put to death. He said, no, I don't mean kill yourself. You should not do violence to yourself. He said, but you know why? Because first of all, we are here under the service of good masters, gods that are the best masters you can have. Secondly, you belong to them. You're like a possession. So it would be terrible for them if you decided to end it before your time. You are doing a kind of tour of duty, he said. You've been stationed here for a reason. And he said Socrates really liked the Roomba, the electronic vacuum cleaning device. And he said, imagine if you were the Roomba if your Roomba came to you and said, I'm done, I don't want to be a Roomba anymore, I'm offing myself. You would be mad at your Roomba and you would want to punish your Roomba. Okay, that's the analogy he gave. He didn't say Roomba, but he said that's what we are. We're like the possessions. Okay? But there is another way of understanding what he's saying where we would recognize what it is he means and why would we want to follow him as quickly as possible. Then he gave us some information about what it is to be a philosopher. He gave us a lot of really golden information in a short space of time, and we've done some work, which is apply the logos to it. Apply our logos to this information. How do we do that? Something called the dialectic. Okay, the dialectic has 12 parts in all. 2 halves and 12 on each half. So you could say 24. Okay. And so we did this to his idea of the soul. Fundamental to the philosopher is something to do with the soul having an existence outside of his body. Only then will what he is saying make sense. How can we follow him if he's being put to death? Well, we might be able to follow him to where he's going so long as we can separate in some way from our physical body. He gave us some information about why that's important. Hey, the things that we're interested in as a philosopher, truth, knowledge, beauty itself, justice itself, the self, the mind. Have you ever seen it? Have you ever heard it? Of course not. Then how can we get these things which we're told, which we most seek after, and also we are instructed to find, to attain as philosophers? The whole maxim, know thyself. Well, how can you know thyself if you can't see the self? What a puzzle. Well, he said there are 2 options. Either it's completely unattainable, or you can experience it in death. And he reminds us, I don't mean the final death. There is a way a philosopher can experience death while he's alive. Of course, the people listening laughed and they said, ha ha ha. The people around here who don't understand what philosophy is, and they call what we do useless and empty talk. And therefore the kind of things that philosophers seek being useless to them makes the philosopher himself useless. Yeah, they do deserve to die, ha 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 ha. Yeah, and they're not making money for themselves, so, they're not pursuing the sort of sense perception pleasures we pursue, so they're pretty much dead anyway. Socrates said, well, they're right, but they don't know why they're right. They don't know the kind of death that philosophers seek, and the kind of death they deserve. So, what kind of death is he talking about? Well, let's revisit the text and nail it down. So we're learning about what it means to be a philosopher from Socrates, the greatest of all philosophers, and what he left us on his last day. And how are we doing it? By reading the text as accurately as possible. A special kind of reasoning that does not involve interpretation. What is interpretation? Adding onto the text your own stuff that isn't there, or leaving out what is there. So it's a very careful kind of reasoning that in doing so is a kind of practice itself, is a philosophical practice. We're learning to see what's there. And we're also engaging our understanding. But if we engage our understanding on this, on the logos, on the kind of reasoning that Socrates talks about related to the soul, it has a special name called dianoia. It's a Greek word that means understanding directed to the highest. Specifically, what exists beyond our physical life. That's dianoia. That's why we're looking at the text. Let's bring it up. Here, Socrates says, I will give the logos. Okay, the logos. The logos is what we are trying to understand because it's the act of understanding the logos that prepares our soul in philosophy for the highest states of mind and the highest insights and the highest understanding. The logos is the paradigm that is understandable and knowable in the highest way. I will give the logos to you, to those who are truly judges. So he's saying, hey, you guys are going to judge me on this. I just had my trial and they didn't understand what was going on. Oh, the question from the chat is the logos the water or the thing thinking? The watcher. That's a good question. That's a good question. Well, take that question with you. Understanding exactly what the logos is the quest of the philosopher. So as long as you're on this journey, you'll be adding to it. But that's a good question. Is it the thing watching? Is it the thing being watched? If there is something we can understand, what is that? But is the act of understanding it also the logos? That's a fantastic question. Put that in your question sack. Being a philosopher is like being an adventurer. It's the archetype of the hero. This is us. And we take... another good question. How does that which is knowing the logos know? That is the question we're on. What is knowledge and how do we do it? So these questions take with you in a little bag in your inventory. This is your question set. You can come up with your own hypotheses too. Take them with you and test them out. They're your ifs. And so we're looking for key terms, we're looking for orders, we're applying it back onto ourselves, and some of the patterns we look for are going to be in triads, are going to be in ones, are going to be in twos, are going to be in fours. That's the art of philosophy. So take those questions, and they're good ones. This is why it's come to light to me, Socrates, that a person who has truly spent their life being engaged in philosophy should be of good cheer when being about to die. Wow, that's what we want. And to be of good hope that he will attain the greatest good there upon the completion of his life. I will try to tell you, Simius and Cebes, they're our pair of knuckleheads that are pestering Socrates. Good for us at the end of his life, so we can hear what he has to say. Simius and Cebes, how this may be so. Okay? For it is likely that so many others happen to be unaware that those who pursue philosophy correctly, how they do it, pursue contacting nothing else than dying and being dead. Wow.
Wow.
If therefore this is true, it would be without a doubt strange on the one hand that having been eager for nothing else in this life, but then on the other hand, upon arriving at the end, they resent that which they eagerly desired and practice. Okay, so we have desire and practice. Philosophy is the desire and practice for dying and being dead. Okay, we've also got contacting. We pursue contacting. And we desire and practice dying and being dead. What the heck? Isn't that crazy? I didn't know philosophy was that. Or Simius laughing. Yeah, of course he's laughing. No. He didn't boo, he laughed. There we go, I pressed the wrong button. By Zeus, Socrates, you made me laugh. Though presently I was not in a laughing mood. Of course not. Socrates is about to leave him, so he's not in a laughing mood. I indeed suspect the majority of people, on hearing this, will believe that these philosophers quite well. Oh, this describes them quite well. Yeah, they deserve to die. On the one hand, our people at home would quite manifestly and thoroughly agree that philosophers are engaged in the business of death. They don't seem to be interested in the things we're interested in. Getting riches, getting possessions, getting fame, power. So they might as well be in the business of being dead. On the other hand, that they are not indeed unaware that they're deserving of the circumstance. Yeah, they're engaged in it and they deserve it. Ha 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 ha. Very funny to him. No. Okay, sorry, I hit boo again. Socrates said they will be telling the truth, except they're unaware, for they are truly unaware of the way. This is what we want to know. What way does he mean? That true philosophers are engaged in death and of the way they are deserving of death. So our translator gave us 3 questions of his own. What kind of death does the philosopher pursue? How does the philosopher engage in the business of death? Why does the philosopher deserve this death? Blah, blah, blah. These are questions we're taking with us. Okay? Contacting, desiring, practicing, and deserving. What the hell has that got to do with philosophy? I thought philosophy was just thinking with your brain. This reminds me of the house of night and the opinions of man. Ooh, please share that story. Of course, yeah, so we're interested in knowledge, which is very different. So he's making fun, hey, the opinions of people would laugh at what you say because they don't get what philosophy is. But we will, because that's what we're doing now. So, why they are deserving of death and the kind of death it is. That's what we want to know. For taking our leave from talking about those people, let us talk about ourselves. Let's stop with the opinions of the idiots. I mean, not idiots, that's not fair. The unaware. And are we led to believe there is such a thing as death? Yes. Is it separation of the soul from the body? Okay, here we go. This is a big one. So somehow it's separating the soul from the body. The house of night always is, and the opinions of man changes. Absolutely. So, we could relate that quote. That's a very good story. Of course, we have Socrates saying that he wants to do 2 things. He wants to examine and mythologize about the journey to that place and what kind of place we think self is. That was a really nice contribution in the chat from Furia about the difference between that which always is, which is what we're seeking. Our question is, well, how do we get knowledge if it's something that always is? Considering the things that we see with our physical senses are always changing. In fact, that's why we call the realm of being the realm that is, and the world that always changes that we see with our physical senses, the world of becoming. How do we transition from the world of... okay. Furia from madness. Oh, okay. Socrates points out in one of his texts that there are several kinds of madness, and the philosopher seeks the highest kind. But that's we'll get to that later. So yeah, we want to examine and mythologize. So we want to understand, but also put it into a fun little story that's poetic, that helps you remember it, that helps you communicate it. So the house of night always is, and the opinions of man always changes is a really nice myth that illustrates the truth. That's the game we're in this text, the Phaedo. So he goes on to talk about how the soul is separating from the body and it's being released, which meets the myth of this because Socrates just took off his chains. He's in prison, so he's released from the chains and he's rubbing his foot saying, how curious for humans that pleasure and pain go one after each other. Just like they're a monster joined at the top. Two monsters, a two-bodied monster. And he said, by the way, is a philosophically virile person, and we jokingly call that an alpha, using today's language. Virile, manly, brave, all of the things that are co-opted by the alpha philosophers nowadays. Would they pursue the pleasures, like eating and drinking and sex? What about building a big body? What about buying clothes, shoes, ornaments, and Bugattis? Interesting. How did Socrates know about Bugattis? It's not in the text, actually. That I might have added that. Do they disdain them, or do they want to partake in them? Truly, a philosopher disdains them, says Simmias. So the business of such a person is not concerned with the body. They stay aloof from the body, since they have turned around. This is a key word for us, turned around, because we've already been talking about the idea of ousia. If there is something in us that can see the realm of what is, and therefore can raise from opinions of the physical world to knowledge of that which always is, how do we see it? And we talk about the idea of turning around away from our physical senses towards the soul. And there's a word for that in Greek called ousia. From the chat, from Madness. So death is a myth in a sense because it is an opinion of the men and not Socrates, and he doesn't buy it. Well said. That's actually a great foreshadowing, because what we're going to get up to soon, today I hope, is exactly what Desphorus is saying. Our understanding of death comes from our cultural myths. And the way we understand death is not an accurate myth. Socrates doesn't buy it. But his friends who are there upset at his death are like, oh, Socrates, you're gonna leave us. And he's like, what are you, crazy? Have you not been listening? Philosophy is the... Actually, let's nail down the exact language. So we've been doing our own dialectic. The dialectic has 4 parts. Just to recap. Okay, dialectic is still very confusing to me. Okay, subscribe to the YouTube page. I'm in the process of posting all of the last series. And in the last series, we read the start of the Parmenides, in which he said, by the way, Socrates, he meets Socrates at the start of his life. So Parmenides is Socrates at the start. The Phaedo is him at the end. And he, oh, cool. Check out those videos. And we unpack this structure for ourselves. So I recommend going through that because there is something beneficial in finding out how we came to the structure. But I'll sort of spoil it a little bit for you and just give you the quick outline. The dialectic is a what if essay that you do yourself. What if the thing you want exists? So what if the subject, so if you're interested in beauty or justice, if 1, then it will be less than 0, and if we hit the non-1. So you're going to have to say more about that. I don't quite follow that. Please say more. So what if, so in this particular instance, we're saying, what if the soul exists? Of course, in philosophy, we mean exist eternally in the realm of being or the metaphysics. Right. Are you familiar with the first hypothesis of Parmenides? Right, so he uses self-er terms like one and many or parts and whole to explain to us a dialectic of the self. So he says, what if? For Parmenides, it was what if the one exists? Or in the first hypothesis, what if the one self is? And he came to a strange conclusion because the one self doesn't exist. Then he goes, okay, now I'm going to do the regular dialectic that you're used to hearing. What if the subject exists? You can say 4 things about it. And what if it doesn't exist? So for him, it was what if the one exists? What if the one, the kind of one that the self is, exists? What can you say about it itself? What can you say about the self in relation to others or how it functions? What can you say about those affected by its functioning? How do they relate to each other? And then finally, how do those others or how do those each other relate back to the subject? The 4 possible ways of talking about it: self itself, self to others to others, others back to self. And you do that for whether the subject exists and whether it doesn't exist. So the first hypothesis isn't in that. The second is this, and then the third and the fourth. So we took a break before we got into the second hypothesis of Parmenides. If the one exists, if there is an eternal one that you can call the self, the one self, because he's doing a hypothesis of the self. What if it exists? What if your self exists as a kind of one that's eternal? That's the second hypothesis. But it was a bit tricky, got really technical, far more than the first hypothesis. So we're jumping into this Phaedo to learn more about how to do philosophy well, because it can be hard sometimes. So, but as we go through the 4, here's the 4, the name, terms, image, and concept. So we're doing a dialectic on the soul, because Socrates is saying, hey, by the way, the soul exists. Exists in for these people means ousia. It has an existence eternally and immortally. The nature of that is ousia. That's the word for it. It also means turning around. And he said, hey, we need to turn around upon ourselves, which means we're being like. So if the soul exists, you can say something about it. You can say something about how the soul functions to another, how those others relate to each other, and then how those others relate back to the soul. So 4 little essays, whether the soul exists, and then you do another one for if the soul doesn't exist. And we've been doing that. So let's recap what we've done so far. Right, yes, right. So in the chat, if the things that we see through our body have parts and decay, absolutely. So when we say is, we mean the realm of being, not the realm of becoming. In becoming, things are always growing or decaying. That's our physical world. And in philosophy, there's a realm of being. And Socrates say, hey, you know how you want to get there? Because that's where knowledge is. That's where truth is. That's where justice and beauty is. That's where all the things we really want, goodness is. But how you get there is somehow separating your soul from the body. But to accept that, we have to say, well, hang on a second. You're saying that the soul exists? The soul is in being? And he gave us yes. He gave us his doctrine. This doctrine here, the great doctrine. And we took that. So here we want to know what kind of death it is. It's separating the soul from the body. And on one hand, this it is to be dead. He calls it dead. When the body becomes free, self according to self. Now that expression, self according to self, gives us a clue. A good film director like Christopher Nolan, I keep saying him, or a good video game creator, gives the hero clues to a puzzle. Not only do you have to solve the question, you have to discover the question. And this is a clue. Self according to self. Self according to self is this. The first category in any dialectic. What can you say about it itself according to or in relation to self? So the soul in relation to itself, not how the soul relates to others, but just the soul itself. So we thought, oh, hang on a second. The author is giving us a clue. And as philosophers, we wear a wizard's hat.
I'm looking for
You're a wizard, Harry.
in an adventure.
Okay, that's Gandalf saying we're an adventurer. And we also wear a wizard's hat.
You're a wizard, Harry.
And we also wear a Sherlock Holmes hat. I don't have a drop Sherlock Holmes yet. So we've got to discover. So, this question from the chat, can the self have private ideas? Depends. If you mean the word idea as concept, yes. If you mean idea is one of those things we do a dialectic on because they exist in being, then it's not private. In fact, that question was Socrates' first question he had in the Parmenides. How do I understand the ideas? Are they just thoughts that we have within us privately, or do they have an eternal existence? So our question is, how far did he go? Parmenides is like, oh, look, you're young. You don't, and it was he was related to, by Parmenides in a fantastic way. He said, look, this is your problem. And he had a little one-on-one with him. And then Socrates is like, when he says Socrates, look, Socrates, you have to learn the exercise that my student Zeno has been doing. That's the dialectic on all of these ideas. What if they exist not within you, but in this realm of being? You have to do this exercise. And Socrates was very sneaky.
Sneaky little hobbit.
And he says, oh, I don't quite understand what this dialectic is. Can you give me an example? But do it not on justice or beauty or knowledge or truth. Do it on yourself, because he knew the self was the highest. So that's why there is not just 4 positives and then 4 negatives. If the one doesn't exist, there were 9. There weren't just 8, there were 9, because the one self is beyond even the realm of being. But we want to see how well Socrates has taken these exercises on board. How far away did he get? How far along did he get? Did it actually make him a better person? Has he lived his life in a way that he thinks he's going to die well and he thinks he's lived well? Well, there are 4 positive. 1, 2, 3, 4. If the soul exists, what can you say about it? What can you say about it in relation to another? What can you say about others in relation to others? And what can you say about those others in relation to self? But also, if the soul doesn't exist, what can you say about it? What can you say about it in relation, and so on? So that's 8, 4 times plus 4. But there was another one on top that's beyond even existence, called the first hypothesis of the one self. It's a very special one that had its own 1 plus 2, 3 plus 3. So there are 4. There are 4, and there are 4 times 2. So 4 times 2 is 8. And then there's 8 categories in every dialectic except for one, which is the special one, which is Parmenides, which gives him 9 hypotheses in total. We only covered the first because we're jumping ahead to the end of Socrates' life. And so we started to do our last time we did a dialectic on the soul, just using the information that we got from the text. So let's read that and let's have a look back at our dialectic. Take notice in it, then, is it anything else than the separation of the soul from the body? And on the one hand, that it is to be dead when a body becomes free, self according to self, wink, separate from the soul, whereas on the other hand, the soul becomes released and separate from the body, self according to self. There we go, the self of the soul. Accordingly, then, is death nothing other than this? No, nothing else. Consider then whether you share the same opinion as I do, for out of this, notice, he recognizes that Simmias is only at the level of opinion. So he's going to relate to his friend in a way that he can understand. He doesn't have knowledge, because knowledge is universal. It's in this realm of being. For out of these conclusions, I believe that we will enter into that which we are investigating. Does it appear that a philosophically virile person, an alpha or sigma or whatever the word is for nowadays, eagerly pursues the so-called pleasures, eating and drinking, least of all. What about sex? Not in any way. What about the other pleasures concerned with therapy of the body? What about buying clothes, shoes, ornaments? To me, truly a philosopher disdains those. Does it appear to you that the business of such a person is not concerned with the body, but that they stay aloof from the body of self, since they are always turned around towards the soul as far as they are able? Take notice then. Yes, Socrates is very based, and we want to get Plato pilled. Right, that's true alpha. The philosopher liberates the soul from association with the body. Liberates, that's the key word. And certainly then, most people, Osimius, that believe that one who neither takes pleasures in the body deserves to be alive, but is close to reaching the dead. The very one who is not mindful of the pleasures that arise through the body. Now, this word mindful is key. It's phronesis. Phronesis has not been translated before. In the all past translations before this more recent one have translated phronesis the same way as it translates wisdom, Sophia, but Sophia and phronesis are two completely different words. And this is one of the problems of philosophy up until now. This is why we can awaken philosophy in its true sense now, that we haven't been able to for the last 1,000 years. Because if we don't have the accurate translation, we'll miss key puzzles. If you translate phronesis as wisdom and sometimes knowledge, and you don't translate it as phronesis in the Greek, you'll miss that there's a huge puzzle. What the heck is phronesis? Our translator gives us an English translation for those who are new to philosophy. Mindful. Of course, what the heck does mindful mean? So this is one of the key puzzles we're taking with us. What the heck is phronesis? It needs to be defined. Otherwise, the text is no good. We can have phronesis of the body, but we want, what about the acquisition of self-phronesis? We want phronesis of the self. So there is something in us that philosophers value most highly called phronesis, and we don't want phronesis of the body. That corrupts us. We want phronesis of the self. Is the body an obstacle to self-phronesis or not? Whether one takes it in common with the search? That I mean, do human beings comprehend any truth by sight or by hearing? Or even the poets, are they forever murmuring to us that we neither see or hear anything correctly, accurately? That's right, even the poets, even our songwriters and poets say, hey, we never see things as they truly are. When we hear our partner talk, we never really hear what they're saying. Right? We don't even hear or see anything correctly. So how can we, if the perceptions related to the body are not accurately not accurate nor clear, neither could the other senses be. Is knowing the self a flow state that you just act upon yourself? This is a good question. Because if Socrates has taken this knowledge on board, he has exercised himself in the dialectic like Parmenides says he needs to. And if he has acquired self-mindfulness, how does that affect his state of being? Because philosophy is supposed to make us better and happier and more able to function. That's our self-triad. Let's jump into our triads over here. We have a whole bunch of triads we're picking up as we go. Triads are fantastic because if you find triads, you can lay them upon each other and see if you can learn something new about one by relating it to another. This one here, the excellence triad or the self triad. Right, self triad on here too. Self triad. There is our reasoning, our understanding, our words, the self logos. What Socrates is conveying is his self logos, and what Parmenides gave was his self logos. We want the excellence of our reasoning, our self logos. We want the being, Another word for being is state of mind, self-state of mind. And of course, the ultimate, which has a state of mind and functions with the logos, is the one self. So the question is, well, hang on a second. Developing your state of mind, I recognize that. Developing your way of functioning, I recognize that. There's a word that we use to talk about a high state of mind and a high functioning we call the flow state. So how does the flow state relate to this? Is Socrates in the flow state? How do we understand the flow state? How do we get into the flow state ourselves? And are there higher states even than the flow state? That's a good question. Take that with you. Put it in your question sack and put it in your inventory as we go on this adventure. Oh, cool. Lots of this is in mythology. So Socrates says, by the way, in the text, Socrates talks about how his dreams, let's find dreams. He spent his last 2 days following the instructions of certain dreams. His dreams this is a few pages back, commanded him to make music. And he thought it was encouraging him. I thought it was the very practice that I was doing. So the dream was encouraging me, like, yeah, keep going, like encouraging runners in a race. Because philosophy is the greatest music. Now, for the Greeks, music means poetry, means all art of that kind. So if they had video games like Morrowind, it would be under the category of music. It's anything that brings into being, that can be done as an art to represent the true ideas. So philosophy, of course, being the greatest music. But he also is wondering if this reoccurring dream is commanding him to make popular music. So I thought it would be safe not to depart until I had atoned by composing verses. Okay, and he says, here he goes. So he made his own. He used the logos of Aesop. He used the fables that were already around, Aesop's fables. But he also did his own, hymn to Apollo. And we did some work on Apollo and realized that, Apollo also is explained with the metaphor of music to represent philosophy. Because in this game of philosophy, there's a rhythm, there's a flow, like you can get into the flow state in music, so too in philosophy. If you notice there's a rhythm and a harmony in the ideas, you can recognize philosophy as the greatest music. So, if you ever, so we're hearing in the chat that there are some myths that do talk about these sort of ideas. So if we were in the business, we would take those and we would tweak them to represent the truth of the logos, the truth of philosophy. Right. So it's good to hear that there is a doorway in. They already talk about these ideas. Our question is, how accurately to this logos are those games? And how can we tweak them like Socrates wanted to do? Tweak them. Okay, now back to where we were we want self-mindfulness. Do we comprehend truth by seeing or hearing? Not at all. Okay, when does the soul grasp the truth then? For on the one hand, when she attempts to examine anything with the body, it is clear at that time that soul is thoroughly beguiled by self. Yes, I have played Elder Scrolls. I've played Morrowind and I played Skyrim. Yeah, I think they're fantastic. In fact, that's what I think of when I talk about this. So, as there is a commonality in the particulars. So there are lots of games that have certain themes that make a good game a good game. As a philosopher, we want to arise from the particulars and ask, what's the ideal? And my hypothesis is the ideal of the hero's journey, the ideal of Morrowind and Skyrim and all those sorts of games is philosophy. And so, if we return to certain texts, we can level up like we're leveling up a skill tree. In Morrowind, if you jump up and down a lot, you will increase your aerobics skill. You'll get better at jumping and you'll unlock other skills in that tree. So too in philosophy, we look for patterns in the logos. Can you find a triad? Is there an idea expressed in a group of 3? Is there an idea expressed in a group of 4? Add them to your skill tree. And what will happen is you'll notice, oh, hang on a second, I've got these 3 different triads from 3 different parts of the text. Let me connect the branches. So in some games, if you connect a skill over here with a skill over here, you give birth to a new skill. Like if you connect, what would be an example? Like a skill with fire with a skill with earth, you might unlock electricity, lightning skill, or something like that. So too do we want to overlay our triads to unlock things. So I use Morrowind and the idea of repeating a skill until you level up in that area to talk about what it means to be a philosopher. So, equally so, we have some triads of our own already. A bunch over here, the one we just talked about. Mind, Logos, and the One Self. But to discover them, we are engaged in a dialectic. So, what if the soul exists and what if it doesn't? So if the soul doesn't exist and we always see through our body, well, yes. So the question was, how are we able to get skill trees like that? Well, if the logos is the paradigm, the model for all of reality. So if you go into music, you'll notice there's a certain pattern that musical notes are following. If you go into geometry, you'll notice certain patterns. If you go into astronomy, you notice there's a certain pattern in the relationship between the planets and their movement and so on. You might recognize that within that archetypal pattern or model we call paradigm, there are certain levels, and those levels are grouped together. So when we look at the dialectic, we see, hang on a second, it's a group of 4. Oh, so this goes into our quadrad skill tree. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But also, within each of those categories, so let's say you're doing a dialectic on the soul, and you're up to section 2, how does the soul relate to pick an other? And we pick a philosopher. If the soul exists, how does it relate to us as a philosopher? There are 3 things you can say about it. What's true, what's false, and what's kind of a combination. And you realize, well, you can say that to anything. It's a pattern of 3. The triad. In the logos, you look for those patterns because the logos is built of patterns. And so we're doing a dialectic on the soul based on this section of the text, and we realized, hang on a second, okay, what if the soul doesn't exist? This is part B. We've got one over here if it does, and one over here if it doesn't. If it doesn't, we drag along the sense perceptions and the sum of the body with our reasoning, our logos, and our dianoia, our understanding. Okay, that's what we can say about it itself. What can we say about it itself? So what can we say about the soul that can't be separated from the body in relation to an other? So number 2 is self to other. What other do we pick? Let's pick you and me as the philosopher. Well, it troubles the soul. It's a corrupting agent. We never sufficiently attain what we desire. We're always filled with the passions. And just here, we just had the idea it is a corrupting agent. So the thing with the dialectic, you can keep going back and adding more to it. And we just read. Let me make sure I've got the text here. Text. We want self-mindfulness. Okay, so the acquisition of self-mindfulness. So we can go back into our dialectic we did and add more to it. That's called ousia. We go back around and add more to it. So what can we say about it? We can say we had this one, it's noesis, it's direct intuitive knowing of ousia, and we can also add its self-phronesis. Okay. We go back and we say, do we comprehend truth by sight or hearing? We don't see anything accurately. They are inferior. The soul is thoroughly beguiled by the body. Okay, so this is Socrates. We can see that the dialectic is in his thinking. He's just flowing with it, like we said before. He's in a flow state, so he can just pick out parts from all parts of the dialectic. And here it's like, well, the soul is thoroughly beguiled by its association with the body. So we want to build up our structure. So we can add it here. The soul is beguiled by the body. So what can we say if the soul doesn't exist, separate from the body? It is beguiled. The soul is beguiled by body. So we're adding in more. Good question. What the heck is beguiled? Jarvis, are you there?
I'm here to assist you with a variety of tasks as best I can.
Can you please bring up the internet?
Importing all preferences from home interface.
Here we go. To charm and enchant someone in a deceptive way. Beguile is a film. To deceive, misled, delude. To be led astray or frustrate with underhandedness. To be deceived. That's what it means to beguile someone. It's nasty. Boo. Thank you, Jarvis. Jarvis is my AI that does my computer. So, is it not our reasoning that if indeed any of the real beings... So take notice, is it not the reasoning, if indeed anywhere, that any of the real beings become quite clear to self? On the other hand, she reasons best. Oh, this was the section that we had to look up because the English is weird here. So we looked up the Perseus, which is the second best translation after the Balboa. For section 65C. Yeah. We bring that up, please, Jarvis.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yep. Here we go. In thought, then, if at all, something of the realities become clear to us. Okay? This is a fantastic section, of course, to illustrate why philosophy has been difficult up until now. In thought, number 1. Something of the realities, number 2. Become clear to it, number 3. 1, 2, 3. Thought, realities, it. Okay? That is one way of translating it. And this is the best we have. This is the best text up until the new translation, the Balboa. If you want a link, there's a link in below my video, where you can download the Balboa translation. Now, why do we say that? In thought, then, something of the realities become clear to it. Now, this sentence illustrates the significance. Let's jump into the Balboa and see the difference. So what is the actual word that is mistranslated in all translations as thought? Logos, logoi. The reasoning we do is not just thought, it's the use, this part means use, of the logos. If you don't have this translation that highlights in purple that it's a significant word, so this translator says, hey, by the way, this is what you would normally read in English, but look, I'm going to put it in purple so you can look at the Greek and realize there's something significant here. Thank you, Balboa. The logos. There is a significant difference between simple thought and the logos. The logos exists in being. The logos is the paradigm. The logos, one of the questions we got in the chat was, are these ideas just you have yourself? A thought is something you just have yourself. The logos is beyond every soul, before souls. It's the paradigm for all creation. It's not just understandable, you can directly apprehend it, therefore is an object of knowing. So we use the word direct intuitive insight, because that's the best we have in English. This is also why we have to bring in Greek words, because direct intuitive insight is still pretty vague. The word is noesis or nous. Yes. Okay. Yes, we have an insight from the chat. Desfuria. So it's like a knower without a thinker. Yes. And that's one of the big puzzles about the object of knowing. What if the knower is knowing something that's itself? So the object of knowing and the knower is the same thing. But what if the act was the same thing? The knower, the knowing, and the known are all one in that experience. That's nous. Right, and as it's all at once, it doesn't require linear thinking like we do with the logos. Yes. So in the chat we get the first knowing. Yes, it is the first knowing. But also because we want to gain it ourselves, we could say it's the last knowing, because we come from that, it emanates, but we want to return. That's what we're asking. How do we return to it? Socrates is saying part of it is separating your soul from the body. That's called death, by the way. And let me explain why that has to be so. So often we use the expression the first and final cause. Not just the first, but also the final, because we are returning. So in the this translation we have, whoops, this one here. In creation, if there's a God, and it is a second creation. Yes, exactly. So if there is a God, that has to have been a second creation from something that created the God. Now that's one of the biggest puzzles in philosophy, of course, because for there to be a creating God, there has to be elements. It has to be an intelligence. It has to want to create. It has to have a model for creation. It has to have the power to create. It has to judge it. So it's all these qualities that are all put together in a oneness. So what is there before even a combination of qualities? Right, so if there is something that we can call a unity, that we call God, or a oneness, for there to be a oneness, there has to first be one. And then our puzzle is, well, if there's a one, of course, that's the first hypothesis of Parmenides, the one. He calls it the one self. How on earth does it create? Because it can't create in the regular way that God creates. Or any creation, through having a model, having something that you mold against your model, judging it whether or not it's good. That's a big puzzle. How does the purely one give birth to the many, or oneness, or the divine? Speaking of divine, The second term we have here is realities. So we saw that in our past translations, thought falls short of the logos, and the realities. Realities, again, not as clear as this guy. The real beings. Ontos is the Greek. So realities is more specific when translated in the right way. The real beings. Why? Because realities is kind of vague. The realities. We're saying, no, they are beings. They are the living, intelligent beings in the realm of being. If it is, it always is, and was never not so. It did become, not become, but is. Right. So you've really nailed on the key word of the first hypothesis, is. Because the first hypothesis in Parmenides, and again, they should be on the YouTube site. You can go back and follow along with that. That's a fun adventure. The first hypothesis is, if the one is, that's the one of the one self. That's Parmenides' one self. So he introduces his, this is how Parmenides introduces his dialectic, the one that he does. He says this: we play a reality-based game. It's a game. It's fun, but it's reality. I must begin from myself and the hypothesis from himself. So there's that flow state. He's speaking from himself. And he's going to do a dialectic on his hypothesis of the self. By hypothesizing, what's his idea of the self? The one self. We play a reality-based game. I must begin from myself and the hypothesis of myself by hypothesizing about the one self, and also whether the one is and whether the one is not, and what must the results be. So the first one is the one self. So in that first hypothesis, he's saying, look, the one self, I'm going to talk about what kind of one is the one self. But I have to use the word is in a very, very particular way. Because normally when we say something is, in fact, for everything else we do philosophy on, when we say something is, we mean it exists. That's what is means. Not only exists, it exists eternally, immortally, with intelligence, power, and so on. That's the realm of being. That's the object of knowledge. But what is the one that is beyond existence? How do we use is in that way? Yes, that's the big puzzle. And we go through the first hypothesis, and you'll only find it in the first hypothesis. Yeah. He says we have to collect ourselves together. Thyself is the highest part of yourself. By exercising more in that way, the dialectic, that appears to be useless to the multitude, and is called by them empty talk. For if you do not, while you are still young, the truth will utterly elude you. This is what Parmenides said to Socrates on his first day on the job. Hey, you're a young philosopher. This is what you got to do. So we're asking, how well did Socrates collect himself together? How good was his exercise in the dialectic? And was he able to attain truth? And it looks like he did pretty well from what we're seeing so far. So, real beings. And finally, these are the three parts of the sentence. Our logos, it's only through the logos that the real beings become clear to what? Autos. Auton, here, autos, self. Through the logos that the real beings become clear to self. Logos, being, self. What does that sound like? And this is why we look for triads and we keep it in our inventory, in our skill tree. Because one of our triads is, where is it? The one that we just talked about. It is only through the logos that the real beings become clear to self. What a sentence.
Wow.
What do you say, Owen?
Wow.
But also, this sentence highlights why we can only rediscover the true quest of philosophy now that we have this translation. Because we have this translation where it's not thought, it's logos. It's not reality, it's the real beings. It's not become clear to it becomes clear to self. Right. The self, through the logos, can see the real beings. And Simius says yes. Okay, Simius, you're saying yes, but we wonder if you can really see it or not. On the one hand, she reasons best. What kind of reasoning? Logos. When none of these things of the body make self suffer, not by hearing, nor seeing, nor suffering, nor any pleasure. So we've got suffering and pleasure. That's a little duad. Put that in your duad skill tree. We've got hearing and seeing. But whenever self is especially most by itself. Yes, the chat is pointing to the fact that by looking through the eyes and the ears, we are seeing the shadows on the cave of our mind. And I think that might be an allusion to the cave analogy in Book 7 of the Republic. Because in the Republic, Socrates is saying, look, we are like chained. Interesting also, in the Phaedo, he starts off chained, but he takes the chains off his legs to have this conversation. In the cave analogy, which is just worth reading, it's the start of Book 7. Jump to there and check it out. I recommend it. It's awesome. Even if you don't fully read the whole book, you can jump back and forth. Right. So in the chat, we're saying, hey, by the way, seeing through your eyes and your ears, that's like seeing the shadows on the wall of the cave. The physical world is the shadows. It's not the real world, which is outside. So the analogy of the cave is actually the analogy of the cave and the outer world. So that's what we're talking about here. How do we make that journey away from those senses to see the outer world? Self, especially by self, we have to take leave of the body as far as possible with no association or contact with it. She reaches for being. That is so. Is it not also the case that the soul of the philosopher most disdains the bodies and flees from it? For she seeks to be the self according to self. Oh, that first category of the dialectic, self according to self, is what we want to be. Interesting. We want to be the soul on its own. So back to our dialectic on the soul. This thing, the first category is what can you say about it itself, according to itself? Here we go. Number one, if the soul is, what can we say about it itself? It's self-phronesis. It's the noesis, which is in English we say the direct intuitive knowing of ousia, which is the nature of that realm of being. And we also added today's self-phronesis. We want to be that. If self is, we want to be this. Makes sense. We want to be the soul on its own. Right. So odd and even, another one of those things that you don't see with your eyes. Interesting. Odd and even is where we were up to in the second hypothesis. Started getting a bit complicated, but that's why we jumped ahead to this. To learn more about how we can read the second hypothesis, the pure metaphysics of the realm of being, better. And one thing that makes it easier, if we can practice separating from our senses, we'll be able to follow the second hypothesis. Right. So, in the chat, someone also pointed to the idea of power. That's one of our triads. This is one of our most fundamental triads. When you're talking about something, you can talk about its being. What's its nature? We can talk about its power. What power does it have? and we can talk about its activity. So if we're talking about the soul, what's its nature? That's self according to self. We could also talk about what power does it have? And then we can talk about how does it relate to us? And being, power, and activity is one of those triads that we have in our inventory. Reading a good book and separating from the... Yes, exactly. So when you read a good book, you might separate from your body. You won't notice you've been sitting on the couch in the same position for an hour or something. Meditation, the same thing. So this is a combination of a good book, but a good subject. And we can also bring in, seeing as we're making triads, another triad that we've talked about before, but I don't think we've turned it into a triad yet. But let's do it, because it's really relevant here. We have this idea of concentration. You can concentrate on something. Whatever you're doing, you have to concentrate on to some degree. Now, in philosophy, we're concentrating on the Phaedo and the logos of Socrates. But it's written in such a way and presented in such a way where it gives us puzzles. We're discovering questions. Puzzles. We want to be puzzled. Puzzled keeps us concentrating on our question. There are whole spiritual traditions based on giving puzzles called koans. You might have heard, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Or if a tree falls in the wood, who hears it? Or what is moo? These are questions that don't have an answer, so you can stay concentrating on them. But also in a state of mind that keeps you puzzled. The good thing about philosophy, it doesn't have to be an artificial question like that. We are naturally curious about the self. We're naturally curious about being, truth, justice, ousia, all of those things in the realm of being, and we're naturally wanting to understand ourselves. So these are natural questions that we can concentrate on. But three separations, the thing reading it, me watching it happen. Right. So this is where we go. So if we can sustain our concentration, that's put you into a state called meditation, which is nothing other than sustained concentration. You can't get your question out of your head. Someone says, hey, come watch the footy. No, I have this question. I want to jump back into the Phaedo. I want to re-listen to this podcast. I want to talk to that guy that I know who's a philosopher. Concentration to meditation. But if you're meditating on a certain idea that's of the logos, that has an existence in being, you can go into a separate state called contemplation. Sustained concentration, meditation. Sustained meditation, contemplation. Contemplation is the state that's being talked about in the chat, where you join with your object of focus. That's why we love one of the reasons why we love Socrates and the works of Plato. The sorts of things we're interested in, like the soul, like right now, we're doing a reading about the soul. We are doing a dialectic on the soul. The soul has an existence in being. So if we can concentrate on it without the distractions of our physical body, we can go into a state of meditation. If we can sustain that meditation, we can experience the soul directly, because it is one of those things that can be known. Contemplation. That's a triad. Right. It's an interesting dichotomy where you let go of needing to concentrate. And the thing about having these as skill trees, so this is in our 3 skill tree. These are triads. So this should add it into another branch of your skill tree. And the reason why I call it that is we can take this triad and see how many other triads are we carrying that we might be able to overlay onto this one to gain further insight. Well, we just talked about one. We talked about being, power, and activity. Can we pick this one up or take this branch of our skill tree and connect it to this branch of our skill tree because they're both threes, they're both triads. Let's do it. So we've got being, power, and activity. Is contemplation experiencing a state of being? So can we use this triad to gain more insight about that triad? Interesting. Well, being are the objects of contemplation the objects that have an existence in being? Oh, that's interesting. Is contemplation itself a state of being? Interesting. Maybe the only things we can contemplate are things that have an existence in being, and maybe that becomes our own state of being, so we sort of let go into a state of being when we reach that explosion of insight. Let's try the other one, power. Does being able to sustain your concentration on a question or an idea that you've been contemplating of the Logos, will that give you a power? Being in that state of meditation where you can't be knocked off your question, no joker can knock you off by telling you that you're no good or you should be doing something else. Does that give you a certain power in your life to be able to be in that state of meditation? Right. So this is contemplation is in the realm of being. So you know what's not in the realm of being? Opinions. Opinions are not in the realm of being. So we can use this triad of being, power, and activity from that skill tree, activity, to gain new insights from this triad. We rub two things together. So there are two sticks on this tree. You rub two sticks together, you create a spark. That's insight. That's why we carry with us as an adventurer.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Questions. We have a question sack. And we have skill trees we carry with us. That's why we reflect on our insights all the time with Usia, turning about and reflecting on yourself. That S doesn't look like an S. Good thing I turned back to reflect on this word to realize that S was funny. There we go. So finally, can we gain an insight from the last part of that triad? Where is it? Here it is. No. There it is. Activity. Can we say that out of all contemplation, meditation, and concentration, is concentration an activity? Is it the most activity of this triad? Is it something we have to do to start off with? And that activity, that activity goes into sustained concentration, sustained activity, becomes a power of meditation. And then if we sustain that power and that activity, we join with our object, and that becomes a state of being. So we have two triads, we lay that on top of each other, we rub them together, and we gain some new insights. That's the fun, that's the game. And you'll find if you want to represent it with mythology, you can use these skill trees and this way of leveling up in a game you create. If you're writing a movie about a character, you could level up in this way. You're using mythology to personify and tell a story about the truth that you are experiencing yourself and sharing with others, because we're all truly philosophers. That's why humanity has to wake up to philosophy, because we're all true adventurers. This will lead us to our destiny.
I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure.
Right, so back to the text. So we want to be all of those things in the dialectic that we've done on the soul that we've collected from this section, from the text. Where's our dialectic on the soul? It is here. This is a really, we could organize this better. I encourage you to be making your own pad or your own workbook or notebook. I like to use, I'm still learning how to use it, the Notepad Obsidian. It's just a note-taking app. But whatever you use to take your notes, have a document open for the soul and have your dialectic of the soul in there. Everything you learn about the soul as we go through Plato and Socrates, add it to one of these 4 sections. Why? Because then we'll come along and read this. And Socrates says, hey, by the way, the soul of the philosopher, that's what we want to do, disdains the body, flees from the body, and the philosopher seeks to be self according to self. This is a big deal. Wow. He's telling us what the philosopher seeks. Holy crap. But if we have a self according to self of the soul, we can learn what we don't actually know what he's saying. To be the soul on its own, I mean, that's okay, but we have more content if we have been working on our dialectic. Let's see the content we have so far. Just on one day's work. What if the soul is? What can you say about the soul self according to self, which is what he just said? Noesis of ousia, each real being, and self-phronesis. So we can add that content into what he's saying because we've been doing our exercise. This is the fun. Oh, so this is what a philosopher wants. Interesting. Whoops. A philosopher wants this. It said self according to self of the soul. We've got that. Number 1 is self according to self. So we can go in here and go, Socrates is saying a philosopher wants noesis or knowledge of ousia and each real being. And also self-phronesis, but we don't know what phronesis is yet. But it does highlight the significance. This also not just gives us an answer, it gives us more to our question, more to our meditation. What is phronesis? Well, if the big dog, Socrates, says, this is what a philosopher wants, then it really adds more weight into what the heck is phronesis. If this is what Socrates is saying, this is the whole point of philosophy, self-phronesis. So it adds more weight, which means we can concentrate on it. Naturally, we're discovering our own object of meditation. And if we hold it, we can unite with it, and if we can hold our object of meditation, we unite with it in contemplation, which is great because Socrates just said that's what a philosopher wants. He wants to be this. So that's what we end up with. By carrying a question, honing a question, polishing a question up like a gem, leveling up a question, just like you level up a weapon or you purify a gem.
Wow.
Like Odysseus, yes. Odysseus. Say it by saying its name, nothing more than killing Cyclops. Nothing in name of something like opening a chest of treasure that you already hold. Yes. Odysseus, whatever you say, it and saying his name was nothing when killing the Cyclops, and the Cyclops crying, help me, no one is killing me. Oh. Right. As nothing as a name of something. Right. So, can you explain that idea? Somebody's saying in the Odysseus, the Cyclops cries out, no one is killing me, because no one is the name of something in particular. But I think you're meaning the word death, like we're understanding it, is very different than what people think death is. So if we cry out, Socrates is like, yay, I'm dying, or a philosopher says, yay, I'm dying, we're like, but we know what he means. He's not actually dying. He's doing the thing he's seeking. He's experiencing noesis of ousia and each real being. So we can cheer. So people cheered, or people were happy when the Cyclops says, no one is killing me. But the Cyclops was sad because it was actually a person named No One. And also in the chat, this experiencing of the soul itself is like opening a chest of treasure we already hold. Absolutely. And death is scary because of the lies we have about it. Absolutely. And lies are communicated through the mythology. So this is a question, because if Socrates is saying this stuff to Simmias and Cebes, and they're only at the level of opinion, they might have this these false beliefs about death. Let's see. So this is what a philosopher wants, and we can see that because we can recognize this self according to self of the soul, and we have a dialectic, and the first category is this. So that's cool. It's come to light for Simmias. What about the following? What do you say? There's a certain self-justice? So these are the other real beings that we're after in philosophy. Justice. Not an example of justice, but self-justice. In the Odysseus myth, he was going to eat Odysseus and his guards, and he was calling to other Cyclops that were ignoring him because no one was hurting him. Yes. Like, no one is hurting me. All right. But the Cyclops thought that the guy's name was no one. Right. So here we want self-justice, justice itself. We want beauty and good itself. But have you ever seen such beings directly with your eyes? Wasn't there something about blinding a Cyclops in Odysseus myth as well? Have you ever seen beauty itself, or goodness itself, or justice itself? The kinds of things that philosophers are interested in finding. The kind of thing, right, the materialists will say, no, there isn't such a thing as beauty itself. There's just a material example. And this is the significance of, right, and so this idea of there is nothing. Sometimes the one self that is beyond all qualities, beyond even being, is talked about as nothing, because it's not a thing, it's beyond thingness. It's the cause of things. So you'll say it's no thing. But in the Parmenides, he says, I'm not saying it's non-being. It's not nihilism. It's not nothing. But it's no thing. In fact, there's a lot of puzzles, because we are supposed to know thyself. But he said, can't be an object of knowledge. We're supposed to understand it with the logos, but you can't attribute logos to it. You can't even give it a name, but we just did. So there's three big questions at the end of the first hypothesis. But here, he's one step down from the first. He's talking about being. He doesn't go to the self, which is beyond being. But we can carry that idea. Because maybe Socrates is sneaking in some clues about what is beyond being. But he's talking to Simmias, who hasn't even reached the realm of being yet. In the Parmenides, he talks about two kinds of dialectics. Xenos, which are exercises of the logos applied to objects of being, like justice, beauty, and good, and the Parmenides dialectic, which goes beyond being. But yeah, so that's the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is about being. That's where we are in our Parmenides read along. And in that realm of being, you're going to find justice itself. The justice, not a just person, not an example in our physical world of changing. Because even a just person's going to grow and die. Even a beautiful woman is only beautiful for a certain period of her life. Then she gets old and dies. But what is the beauty itself that we recognize, that we have within us, that allows us to recognize it, the hidden treasure that's within us? That beautiful things might awaken us to the treasure hunt. If someone says, oh, do you think that woman's beautiful? Yeah, she is. But she's far away. But then she walks closer to you and you realize it's an old man. What? I thought it was a beautiful girl. So if the beauty wasn't in that person, just were mistaken because of how far away she was, or he was, then what was the beauty you saw? Another question like that is, oh, have you seen beauty in that person? What about that person? Well, if beauty is in both of them, it can't be in them because they both share in it. These are the sorts of questions you can ask about justice and beauty and goodness that point to a realm of being. And we philosophers say, well, if that's the case, I want it. We want the excellence. We want the truth. So, and this is what he's saying. Is there a certain self-justice in a certain beauty apart from all of the experiences you see with your eyes? Have you grasped the selves through any other bodily perception other than the eyes? Not just justice, beauty, and good, but greatness itself, health itself, strength itself, and in one logos, the ousia of all the others. So here we have our big name, ousia. All of those beings, you could give one word and say ousia. The one word, ousia, counts for all of those realms of being. Whatever the self happens to be, whatever you're interested in. If it has a self, infinity itself, limit itself, sameness itself, whole itself, part itself, justice, beauty, good. Accordingly then, is that which is most true of selves contemplated? There's our word from our triad. Bing, bing, bing. Do we have a sound effect for that? No. No. Okay, enough of that. We see contemplated and we go, because we've recognized that that's from our triad. So we contemplate the ousia and the truth of the truth of the selves, not through the body. Or does it happen in the following way? Whoever of us prepares themselves, okay, last one, prepares themselves and most accurately, keyword, look at the accuracy. Right, so we look for good in our physical world. Everything we do, we seek that which is good. We want to eat a good sandwich. We don't want a bad sandwich that's spoiled. We want to do a good activity, and it's good for us if it makes us better, makes us happier. But then a philosopher will go, hang on a second, if you can have a good sandwich, and you can have a good job, and you can have a good time with your friends, what is goodness itself? Before it was given a particular in a sandwich, before it was given a particular in a this or that. What is self-good? He's saying self-good and self-beauty and self-justice and self-greatness and self-health and self-strength. Whatever self, that's the ousia. You're looking for the ousia of them. When you find the object of contemplation, and that's interesting. For a second, it might terrify you like a jump scare. It absolutely might. And you'll go like this. And you think you're going to go this. And you'll fall down. And then outside you'll hear from the noise. Again, that's the significance of the logos. If you are lucky enough to, or you're lucky enough to experience the ousia of any of those things, but your method of reaching there was through philosophy, through the logos, you have something you're carrying with you in your back pocket. Wow. Allowing you to recognize that which you're experiencing.
Wow.
And you won't be just saying, you won't experience it and say,
What? What?
So this is the significance of philosophy as the spiritual method. If you just have a one-off experience, you might not recognize it. You might be scared of it. If your mythology that you bring with you tells you that there are devils or demons or God is a nasty thing, like a good person is to fear God, then you might not really recognize what you're seeing, and you might... A weaponless naked man? What? What's that about? Then you might experience... someone's saying something funny in the chat. Hopefully they're going to explain it. So if you have a bad mythology that tells you to fear the metaphysical, right, then you might flee from it and not embrace it. That's why the logos, doing this dialectic is so important. Because next time you run into it, in a dream or in meditation or just however it happens, you'll be able to go, oh, I've got a dialectic on this. I'm experiencing the ousia through noesis, and it's a real being. This is what happens if you separate the soul itself. This is why you do the exercise. Make it yours. You can take it with you. And, oh, right, yes, in the Republic, there is the idea of a naked man. So there's a section of the Republic where so you're really familiar with the Republic. That's really cool. How did you get into philosophy, may I ask? There is a section of the Republic that the chatter is referring to where somebody says, if Socrates says that for a state to be just, and of course he means the soul, it has to be ruled by philosophers. So the rulers have to become philosophers, or the philosophers should be made philosopher kings. And then Glaucon, I think, who was listening, says, Socrates, if people hear you say that, they're going to strip off and they're going to take up their weapons and they're going to run at you. Because you sound like what everybody says. Everybody says, well, you know what? I'm a priest and I think priests should be running the world. Or, you know what? I'm a scientist. Scientists are most rational. Scientists should be running the world. Everyone says that. So if you say, oh, philosophers should be running the world, you sound like everybody else. So everyone's going to... And back then, they would fight in the nude for some reason, back in ancient Greece. So they would strip off and they'd run at you. So I think that's what you're referring to, right? Anyway, so I think you're saying we don't want to have that reaction to the truth about our object of contemplation. If we experience the ousia... So how did you... Can I ask the first... It was your joke. How did you... Oh, you're following the read-alongs. Have we met already? I mean, I'm happy to hear. So I also have a read-along with... Oh, well... I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you. I should have, because you're... Oh, we haven't met. Do I know you already? So I have a read-along with Mindy Mendel, who, by the way, has written a fantastic book about philosophy. If you read that, you'll save yourself 10 years. I honestly reckon. It's... I'll get the book in my break. I comment on Wen's YouTube? On Mindy's YouTube? So, what's the name of her channel? What's the name of Mindy's channel? So Mindy, who's got a fantastic book, I think it's called Discovering the Beauty of Wisdom. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It really outlines a lot of like what took me 10 years to learn myself in philosophy. Get that book. But also we have a read along where we read all about Platonism. Thank you, the Furious. All about Platonism. Follow that channel on YouTube where we read along with the text. And Mindy shares, guides us, and she plays the dialectician role, where she asks the questions and she draws out of us, me and Jacob, we're the interlocutors, insights from the text, and it's fantastic. And someone in the chat here recognized a joke that was made about naked men charging at Socrates. So that's cool. I'm glad to have you in the chat, dude, or whoever. I don't know if you're a dude. Cool. Information eating, watching a lot of... Yeah, oh, she's great. Mindy's great. So, speaking of greatness, Mindy has greatness. That's this word here that's translated as magnitude. The Greek's greatness. But we want to know what greatness itself is. They, them, cool. So, that's contemplated not through the body, but if whoever prepares themselves and most accurately understands, there's our word dianoia. That's what we're doing by going over this again and putting it into our dialectic. If you do this dialectic on each self that you investigate, this person will approach most close of the noesis of each being. So that's the intuitive knowing. That's what we've been talking about. So, which is interesting. So here's Socrates saying, hey, by the way, if you most accurately do dianoia of each of the self you investigate, we recognize that as this, the dialectic. That's how you most accurately understand something, which means he is telling someone else to do this, which means he has done it. He must have done it. He must have mastered this because he was told to do this. Right. So asking the why of why do I do these things? And that the self. So if you, the self that you investigate, so the why of why you do anything. Why do you do anything? Well, you think it's good, or you think it's beautiful. That person or that thing will be beautiful, or it'll be good. But if you ask, what is the self that's motivated your action? What is self-beauty? What is self-justice? What is self-goodness? And you apply the dianoia to it, which is the dialectic, you are preparing yourselves to most accurately understand each of them, and that will bring you closest. This game here brings us closest. That's why when we recognize that language, we started to do it to the soul. But we could also do it to philosophy, because he's laying out what exactly philosophy is. So we should have another dialectic over here, if philosophy exists, and if it doesn't. In fact, I encourage anybody watching along to be doing that as we go through this. And in our if philosophy exists, what do we say it is? Well, it is direct knowing of each being. It is preparing yourselves most accurately through understanding. So these would be in one of those categories. So maybe the last category, how do others relate back to philosophy? We prepare ourselves. Let's do it. So let's do a if philosophy exists. If exists. And then we also have to do if philosophy doesn't. And now what's interesting about this is this goes back to one of the questions we've been carrying all philosophy all the way through this video series and the last one. What is philosophy? And what isn't philosophy? And this dialectic will answer that question for us. Why? Because the way that philosophy... Right. So this is removing the deception or ignorance, removing the lies and opinions we have about. So we talked about reading the text as accurately as possible to remove interpretation. But in the chat, we've seen, by the way, this dialectic, preparing yourself through most accurately understanding, prepares yourself for the direct intuitive knowing of the beings. And that would be seeing it as it is, seeing reality as it is. So you could say philosophy is purifying yourself so you can see what is there. Now, knowing nothing wouldn't be this, because you're knowing everything. If it's the knowledge of everything in eternity, if the same object of knowledge, the ousia, is the paradigm for beauty, the paradigm for justice, the paradigm for goodness, in any self that you want to say, then you could be more accurately saying knowing everything. Knowing everything that can be known. What is beyond everything is the first hypothesis. That's not here, but it is a question. He's talking about knowing all these selves. But yes, that's the first hypothesis. If you know everything, then you know everything. But to know nothing, if you mean nothing as that which is not a thing, because it's even more profound, that's know thyself in the Greek. Know thyself, know the oneself, which is an object of knowledge, but in one way isn't. Figuring out what the heck that means is the puzzle of the first hypothesis. But here we're not talking about that. Here we're talking about knowing being. Now, if philosophy exists, you can say what it is and what it is itself. Whoops. Self to self. If it doesn't exist, what can you say about it itself? And then how does it function to another? Let's make that a bit. Let's move that up a bit. How does having been affected by philosophy, how do the others relate to each other? And then finally, number 4, how do they relate back to philosophy? And we do the same for if philosophy doesn't exist. What can you say about it? What can you say about philosophy functioning? What can you say about people affected by philosophy? And what can you say about how people relate back to philosophy? Now, King 9, what is kingly? Is to act as a king, That's an interesting thought. So yeah, you're hoping that the object of knowledge hopefully has an effect on you so that you can function with it. That's the significance of the logos. If we encounter this ousia of beings, number 1, if we've purified our false mythology so we're not afraid of it, we're not going to run from that experience. We're going to try and stay in it for as long as we can. Number 2, if we have the logos with us, we might be able to recognize there are levels. It might be first experienced as beauty, but then you can go, hang on a second, the object of beauty, that's also the object of justice. I'm going to look for justice in here and go deeper. It's only one experience, but there's depth to it. And finally, you want to be able to come out of that experience with the logos so you can function with it. Use it as your model for when you act justly or when you act beautifully in the world. The acting part feel the same. Right, and so yes, and so if you can have that with you as your model, you'll be more unified. So the same part will be functioning as knowing, right? So you're bringing yourself together, collecting thyself together. And how do we do it? How do we collect ourselves together and unify ourselves? Collect thyself together by exercising more in that way that appears useless to the multitude, the dialectic, and called empty talk. Did you not? The truth will elude you, says our friend Parmenides. So, if philosophy exists, now what's interesting is Plato is giving us some information about philosophy. It is noesis of the beings. So we can say, what is philosophy? If it exists, noesis of the beings. Also, ousia. But what's interesting is, and by the way, he said, how do we, if we're the other, then we can say how philosophy affects us, how we would relate to other philosophers, if it exists, and finally, how do we relate back to philosophy? That's what we just read here. We would prepare ourselves most accurately to understand each self which we investigate, because that will bring us closest to our goal. So we would say that. We'd write that here. So we would prepare most accurately. We would prepare ourselves. Prepare ourselves to most accurately dianoia, understand each self in being, because that will approach the closest to approach philosophy closest. Now, Right. So there's an acting immediately from this object of noesis with philosophy, but also if we have gone through the activity of purifying our false beliefs. So we can say there's two parts to philosophy. There's the... Actually, I think we've got a triad of this already. We can say that there is... Surely we have a triad of this already. Yes. So here we go. So this is our activity, power, being triad. But underneath we can say, well, philosophy has the logos, which is what we're learning. So we can perfect our understanding to make us closest to the noesis of each being. But also we have the anti-logos or pathologos, which causes our problems. So you could say, if you perfect yourself in this way and also purify yourself in this way, you're getting closer to it. By the way, the dialectic can be applied to doing both. And you can have a mythology that's true, and you can have a crappy mythology that makes you fear your own enlightenment or your own mind or your own thinking. Oh, and here's this triad we had before. In each category of the dialectic, you can say what's true about it, what's false about it, and what's both true and false. By the way, you can lay this triad on top of this triad and realize the anti-logos is false, the logos is true, and the dialectic or mythology can be both true and false. You can apply the dialectic to both. Or you can have a mythology that's both. It's false in that it's not actually a real person, it's a superhero, but it's true in that it represents the truth. So these are three different triads that we've laid on top of each other. So you're tuning yourself by taking away what's false, the anti-logos, by learning what's true, and practicing it. And also making mythology and whatever art you like to create. Use it to mythologize the... like... Factorio is a game about making factories that makes factories in an automatic way. The intelligence of its working and its acting is the logos. Oh, I'm not going to say yes or no because I don't want to ruin a good question. Because that's a good question. Where's the logos? And that is a good hypothesis. So take that hypothesis with you. Take that question with you. And also take that mythology with you. So let's add another sack to our what it means to be a philosopher. Where can we fit it? Here. So take your myth that you create, like Factorio, take that with you as in your sack. Oops. Because you might see that it's actually a good metaphor, and you might see more, or you might find ways of perfecting that metaphor. So bring your mythology with you. And also, if you're doing this dialectic, turn it into a mythology too. So we've got dialectic on philosophy. What's interesting about this is we were asking what is philosophy and what isn't a philosophy. We talked about many ways of making that distinction. One way of making that distinction is simply the word a versus the. The Greek had a word for the Latins didn't. They only had the word a, so they could only look at examples. A beautiful thing, a just thing, a good thing, a whole thing. Because they didn't have the word the in their language, when the Romans murdered like Socrates was murdered, the philosophers and the Greek, and they took over, we didn't have the word the, so we couldn't ask what's the beauty, the goodness, the very things we just read. So these questions, right. Good. So, yes. So, include intelligence and ousia in your understanding of Factoro, as well as the logos. You're building your own mythology. Just like Socrates took Aesop's fable and added these logos terms to improve it, and leave something for the world, yeah, you're doing the same. So good. So these things here, beauty, justice, good, greatness, health, strength, we could only look at A. That's the modern tradition of philosophy. That's where we are now. That's what we have to wake up from. I hope that doesn't offend anyone, but I don't mean in an offensive way. So don't get naked and run at me. So another way of distinguishing what philosophy is compared to the misunderstanding about philosophy is not just looking at the historical contents of, the Dark Ages and the Roman Empire and the Third Reich and what they thought, not just looking at the word and the, but looking at if philosophy exists. Because the most common understanding of philosophy is this: philosophy doesn't have an existence in being. It's all the things that we've been talking about if you cannot separate the soul. So all these things here. If the soul doesn't exist, and that means we can't have noesis of ousia, we're dragging our senses along. Our soul is beguiled by the body. We are filled with many passions, desires, fears, illusions. We're others to others. How do we relate to other people if philosophy doesn't exist, meaning the soul away from the body? War, civil discord, battles, trying to acquire possessions and riches. So that's if philosophy doesn't exist. Also, it's if you can't separate the soul. If philosophy does exist, then there has to be how does philosophy relate to us? A way of knowing. It gives us a way of knowing. Or ousia. That's what we've been talking about, or separating the soul. If philosophy doesn't exist, we have the current understanding of philosophy. What is it? Opinions. Theories. Opinions is messy. So notice, first category is what is it? Self itself. How does philosophy relate to us? If it doesn't exist? Well, it doesn't really. So how does philosophy relate to itself if it's just opinions? I don't know. I have to think about that one. How do people relate to each other? They debate. They debate opinions. They fight. Battle. Civil discord. How do others relate to self if that's a philosophy? Well, most hate it. Most will hate philosophy. So this is others. So if philosophy doesn't exist, and by exist we mean this, exist, knowing, then it's just opinions and theories. Self itself. How does philosophy relate to others? I'm not sure. How do others relate to others if philosophy doesn't exist? If it doesn't exist, how could we know it? Yes. So there's no knowing. So in how does philosophy relate to others? It is disconnected. So in each category, you can say three things. You can say what's true about it, what's false about it, and what's both true and false. There's our triad. So you could say it's disconnected. You could also say what you just said. What's false about it is it's knowable. What's both true and false is it's doesn't exist. I was going to say it doesn't exist because it's true, it doesn't exist in this way, but it's false because it exists in its corrupted way. So you could think of something that's both true and false. Does these, when asking people, Interesting. I'll ask people what they think. Right. So if you've really mastered this, if you've practiced the dialectic in everything you're interested in, it can be how you function. It can guide your questions. Right. So this could be, right. So this is how some people with crazy philosophies, they use philosophy in this way, to debate opinions, to fight in battle. So that's what's true about it. What's false about it is you would never say that there is unity or togetherness or something like that. There's always going to be that, so there can't be unity or shared understanding. Right. So you can think, you could also think of something that's both true and false. What's true and false is, how people relate to other people, to others is, I don't know, maybe that's true and false because there is unity and shared understanding. Oh, there's no understanding. Okay, there's no understanding, so that's false because it's just opinions. Opinions are different than understanding. But you could say what's true and false is unity, because there's no true unity with all human beings, but there is a kind of unity only within their group. Of shared opinions. So that's something that's both true and false of how others relate to others if philosophy doesn't exist. And this can guide your mythology. So if you're going to create an essay or something, you might make this, the first film could be if philosophy doesn't exist. Act 1 would be, what would you say about it itself? So philosophy you'd represent with a character like Batman. If Batman existed, what would follow? How does Batman relate to another person? Like, how does Batman relate to Joker? And then how does Joker relate to other villains? And then finally, how does Joker relate to Batman? So this could be Act 1, 2, and 3 of your film. Now, but what's interesting about this dialectic is this whole dialectic is actual philosophy that we're learning versus modern philosophy. Because what characterizes modern philosophy is they don't go above the realm of becoming, which means they don't enter the realm of being, which means they don't enter the realm of existence. So this is not only is this a good exercise that will prepare yourself to most accurately, approach closest. Not only does this dialectic on philosophy prepare your understanding most accurately to allow you to approach most closely the noesis of each being, but you have a cool way of understanding when there are debates around philosophy. All of the philosophers on YouTube that just spout their own alpha opinions or something. Because you can see them, you're just in this. You're just in here, you just live in this world. It's simple. Oh, what's that? Most people hate philosophy. Oh, that's because they think philosophy doesn't exist. Because it's just used to, just debate, dialectic here. You're just fighting. Oh, you're just in this world. So you can use it to see what's there. Right, this is what is. And so in the chat it pointed out, so if this is what is, then it will always arise. So you could say, this same dialectic on philosophy can be discovered in 1 billion years in the future, 1 billion light years away, some alien species that has evolved logos, have evolved the ability to reflect on themselves, or ousia, and have evolved intelligence. They'll discover this exact same dialectic. It's discoverable. It's there. That's what, yes. So What can you say about if philosophy exists? You can say it's discoverable. Yeah. So in the chat we have lots of good points that I encourage you and the listener to add into your do one dialectic. If philosophy actually exists, and by existing we mean pertains to the realm of being, what can you say about it itself? Pick another. How does it relate to? I like to pick people. So create your own. Open up a notepad or a Word document. Set up one page for each of these, and then every time you learn something about philosophy, or every time Socrates says something about what the many think philosophy are, pull up this side and add it. Build it up. And then print it out and put it on your wall. Right, that's what we're being encouraged to do. On that note, I have to take a quick break. I'll be right back. Spend the time to open a Word document on whatever it is you're interested in, and set out these 8 categories. Is a category as a whole counted? What does that mean? The thing as a whole could be this one here. If philosophy exists, what can you say about it as a whole? What can you say about it itself? Then how does it function? You can pick any, by the way, pick any other. Like philosophy, I like to pick how does philosophy relate to us? But you could do another dialectic and make the self philosophy and the other justice. If philosophy exists, how does, what can you say about it itself? But how does it relate to justice? Philosophy gives you a way of knowing justice, gives you a way of experiencing justice. And then how does justice relate to another person or another idea, or justice relate to itself? You could say, okay, how does justice relate to people? Make this other people. Humans therefore have a way of, if philosophy exists, and then philosophy relates to justice, then justice relates to us, we have a way of knowing justice. Humans can solve human problems. We can create an ideal world. We can solve the war and problems because we can know justice. And then finally, how do humans relate back to philosophy? We all study philosophy at school because all world leaders should do philosophy, because that's where you get justice from. This would be a dialectic if you made other justice. You could pick anything. But that would make a good story. And also you could have in your story another character, or based on if philosophy doesn't exist. Then it's just opinions. Then what? And then how does philosophy relate to justice? The person with the most common opinion is seen as what's just. So what's true and false is justice exists because it doesn't really exist. It just exists and is in a... Oh. So what we're saying is, when you do a dialectic, you can... Oh, discoverable was here. You can pick anything for the subject if philosophy exists, if time exists, if excellence exists, but you can also pick anything for the other. So you could say, if philosophy exists, and make other justice. How does philosophy relate to justice? Wouldn't the right opinion still work best? And just lays in places. Well, yeah, so if philosophy doesn't exist and you made the other, so the self is philosophy and the other in your dialectic, because dialectic means two. You have two primary ideas, justice if philosophy doesn't exist, how does philosophy, which you've just defined as opinions, how does it relate to justice? And in your story, have a character who represents philosophy. Philosophy does exist. So how does he relate to justice? So, how does philosophy relate to justice? Philosophy gives you a way of knowing justice. Philosophy allows justice to be understood. Philosophy makes justice apprehendable by all people in all cultures. So how does justice relate to everybody? So now that you can bring in other people. Well, justice informs the people. Justice is what people make their world based on. Justice brings a united world together. So how do people relate to each other? And then how do we relate back to philosophy? Given your story about justice, everyone studies justice at school. First grade, we learn about justice. We learn about philosophy. How do we relate back to philosophy? Everyone learns philosophy first day at school. And because the theme has been justice, you can direct your answers in that way. So you could say, well, if this follows, how do others relate back to self? And the self is philosophy. You could talk about everybody learning philosophy at school, but because it has a justice theme, you might want to focus on justice-related answers. So how do we relate back to philosophy? Every leader does philosophy. Every election, the criteria for each candidate is whether or not they can do a dialectic on justice. We demand an understanding and a knowing of justice from every leader. So you could do a dialectic on philosophy, on any other. But do you see how depending on what you pick for your other, it can guide the flavor of your dialectic. And if you turn it into a movie or a game or a story, it'll guide the narrative. Right. So you could use good diet in relation to the body as a myth to mythologize your actual dialectic on philosophy in relation to justice, or philosophy in relation to time, or philosophy in relation to soul. You can pick anything, so long as they are something that actually exists, one of the selves. And also you could have a episode 2, or have characters that represent if philosophy doesn't exist. Right. So in this category, if philosophy doesn't exist, how does it relate to justice? Let's say that's the one you pick for this particular essay. Then how does philosophy, what is philosophy? What is philosophy itself? How does philosophy relate to justice? How does justice relate to people? And then how do people relate back to philosophy? They like to hear philosophies that, people like to hear philosophies that justify their opinions, that justify their injustice. That's how people view philosophy. They'll make a podcast saying that whatever prejudices they have is the true philosophy. That would be how people relate back to philosophy. So there's a category for each one of those. And what we're doing is we're organizing our thoughts most accurately. And why do we want to do that? Whoever of us prepares themselves and most accurately understands each self which they investigate, this person will approach the closest to the intuitive knowing, the noesis of each being.
Wow.
That's what we're after.
Wow.
That's the big one. That's what we're after. That's what Socrates is saying we're after. I don't know why chicken's there. By all means, take notice then. That person will do this most perfectly who approaches each being with the self-understanding, right, the dianoia. We got him. Without associating their sight with their understanding, nor dragging any other sense perception, not one, with their reasoning. So now that we've got it, we've got the chicken. Now that we've got our goal, he's giving us more specifics on how we do it, okay? Go back to here and practice doing this by not dragging any self-perception, not one with their reasoning, and uses their understanding. But if they use their understanding in this way, that purifies. So this is a key, purification. We know it's key because the narrative, the mythology of the story says Socrates' death was put off because a ship was sent to Delos in honor of the god Apollo, which is the god of philosophy, as a ritual for purification. And no people could be killed in that time. That's why Socrates' death was put on hold, because the city had to be purified and remain pure. So this word purifies jumps out at us. It jumps out at us. It's a noise for jumping out at us. Okay, I have to think of something better for that. So if we liberate ourselves as far as possible from our eyes and ears, and in a word, the sum of the body, since it troubles the soul, and does not enable her to acquire truth and mindfulness. So when she is so associated, it is not this one who reaches the being, if anyone does. Okay, so that takes us back to here. If you have any ideas for sound effects, just let me know. That fit, they help us. Right, so if the soul doesn't exist, drags our senses with the sum of the body. But we also said it troubles the soul. Here we go, got it here, we've already got it. Troubles the soul. If we drag our sense perceptions along with our soul, it troubles our soul. And it does not enable us to acquire truth or mindfulness. So what's false about it? Never sufficiently attain what we desire. So what's false is we never... So how do we relate back to the soul? Maybe it's here. Yes, we never attain what we desire, and we never attain truth or phronesis. So we're adding to our dialectic from the text. Right. Right, yeah, that's interesting. So how exactly do we pull this stunt off? Right. So I think there's a name for that in Indian philosophy. Let me just pull it up. See, what we're doing is a jnana yoga, which yoga means to join. Obviously, we know what we're joining with now, thanks to Socrates. But the way we do it is through our understanding. Now, there is a kind of yoga that happens that they talk about through work. So this pushing through pain barriers with sustained focus. Hatha yoga? No, that isn't that. No, that's breathing. There's a word for karma yoga is a doing yoga. Kundalini yoga. Bikram yoga, Yundu yoga. I don't know what it is, but there is a word for work yoga. So in the chat, talking about focusing, that sustained concentration, but then pain barriers come in. Sometimes even just meditating, sitting on a mat or whatever, being able to somehow push through those pain barriers until you separate from your bodily senses completely. Right. So we want to do that for philosophy. And so our question is, well, how do we pull this stunt off? How do we separate? How do we do this? Is it not necessarily the case then that all this makes the noble philosophers believe and say in relation to others something like this? So now we have our in relation to others. So this goes into our category. What do we do? What do noble philosophers, if this exists, if philosophies exist, what do we do in relation to each other? We say these things. Inasmuch as it is likely to be, just as it were, a straight path with no deviations, there's our sustained focus. To guide us along the logos in the consideration that as long as we possess the body, our soul, she is contaminated with such a corrupting agent. So now we can go back into our... I should have done this in a better place. It's getting a bit messy now. The corrupting agent. Oh no, we've got it. Corrupting agent. There we go. Corrupting agent. The corrupting agent. We shall never sufficiently attain what we desire, and if we affirm this to be the truth. So we say this to each other, and we also somehow affirm this to be the truth. So it has to go from something we believe and say. This is how we relate to each other. So that's others to others. We believe and say to each other, to other philosophers, this. We repeat it. But also we affirm it to be the truth. So we have to go through some confirmation that it is the truth. And of course, truth is something that we're saying here. Truth and phronesis is this. So we not only believe this, right. So Jordan's philosophy of clean your room, Jordan Peterson, would be something here. If philosophy didn't exist, how would we relate back to philosophy? Clean our rooms. That's how we would relate back to philosophy. So we have to say this stuff and we have to affirm it, which means we have to go through this process of developing our understanding, separate it from our senses most fully, do it as accurately as possible, which is the dialectic, and then that will help us to directly experience it as the truth, and that will allow us to affirm it. So how do philosophers relate to other philosophers? We say this, we believe it, and then we understand it, and then we know it. So we go through a development of our cognitive functions. It's how we relate to our friends. Oh, thanks for the follow. Random individual. Right. So you arguing with Jordan Peterson would be one way that you relate back to... No, it'd be others to others. So if philosophy doesn't exist in the realm of being, you would debate opinions. You would say, hey, Jordan, get off my ass about my messy room. We'd fight each other. And he'd go, come on, guys. Hey, welcome. We are finding out what exactly philosophy is by reading what Socrates said on his last day alive in his prison cell in the Phaedo. And we're taking what he's saying and we're putting him into a structure called the dialectic. If your subject exists, or if philosophy exists, and for Socrates exists means exists outside of the body, it's not something the truth about justice and beauty and the truth about reality and ourselves isn't something you see with your eyes. Of course, you don't see truth walking down the street with a hat on. You go, hey, that's a nice hat, truth. And he goes, well, thank you, sir. You don't do that. You have to see it with your with another sense. And he says, by the way, that's why I'm not sad to die, because I'm separating my soul from the body. And my whole life, our philosophy has been the art and practice and the desire for death and dying. Right. And he's saying, by the way, tell my friends to follow me. And Simmias is saying, hang on a second. You're telling me to tell your friends to follow you? You're going to die. You're telling me to kill. You want me to tell them to kill themselves? No, don't kill yourself. Philosophy. To do philosophy is to experience these things that have an eternal existence. Justice, beauty, health, excellence. They exist in a realm of being, but you can't see them with your eyes. You have to separate your soul from your body, and that's called ousia. And by the way, separating your soul from your body, that's death. So yeah, my whole life I have been dying and practicing the art of dying and practicing the art of not just dying, but being dead. So our question is, well, how the heck do we pull that stunt off? That's where we are right now in the text. Death is an illusion to conceal us from seeing the absurdity of life. Right, so we all have different opinions about death, and we want to know what... Right. We want to know what Socrates tells us is the significance of death for the philosopher. And in every second yes. And in one sense, we die every moment. Every moment, there's an instant, there's an instant, there's an instant. So everything is and then out of being, is and out of being. Can we see that gap? What is it to be out of our body? So, if we can follow the logos without our body, if we don't, we will never attain what we desire. For on the one hand, the body keeps us busy in numberless ways through its need for sustenance. Right. So good point. Death can liberate you from the suffering if used well. Right. And so we want to nail down exactly what Socrates says death is for a philosopher. And also, how do we pull that stunt off? Suffering is something is good and having pleasures bad. Pleasures and pains are another question we have. We have to see what Socrates does with pleasure and pain. The need for sustenance and any disease that befalls it will keep us busy and impede our chase for being reality. As philosophers, we chase for being. We chase for this reality. Oh yes, this is a book. This is the Phaedo. It's Socrates' last day in prison. Thumbs up. 2 thumbs up. So his last day in prison, he's about to be put to death by not following the official religion and in fact saying he has a daemon, a spirit guide that communicates to him providentially, communicates through the logos a benefit, and that was against the rules, so he's being put to death. So in this Phaedo, by the way, there's a link to it if you want to get in the FAQ, if you want to get a copy. So he's saying, so his friends are like, hey, Socrates, you're going to die. What, that sucks. What can you tell us about your life and about philosophy? And he's saying, hey, don't be sad. I have been, in fact, you should want to follow me. Doesn't make sense that if someone has spent their whole life engaged in the activity of death and dying and desiring to be death, then finally when they reach their goal, why would they be sad? So he's made the point that he's been dying a lot as part of being a philosopher. And he's saying, by the way, that's because it's necessary for our chase for being reality. But the body, right. Sometimes, yes, if the disease befalls our body, it can burden us and distract us from following with no deviation or sustained concentration, the logos, which is our understanding, a certain kind of understanding that involves this. This is us.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Looking for key terms, looking for patterns, looking for the selfer terms. Now, the selfer terms are the terms like beauty itself, or justice itself, or goodness itself. They're the ones that have an existence and being. We develop questions. We mythologize. We make stories about our questions and our understanding. We develop hypotheses. And we look for patterns, 1s, 2s, 3s. That's what it means to do philosophy, following the logos. Right, so let's jump back into the text. So, a disease and the need for sustenance. The body also fills us with passions and desires and fears and illusions and foolishness. That's a good list. What if being drunk becomes your baseline level of soberness? Well, hey, so long as it doesn't impede you from doing this, then keep going, so long as it's doing this. But if the body fills us with passions or desires, fears, illusions, and foolishness, then so, as the saying goes, truth and in reality, not any phronesis, mindfulness. Again, our question is, what the heck is phronesis? Don't know yet. Not truth, reality, or mindfulness of any kind whatsoever arises in us because of the body. For the body and its desires gives us nothing other than war, civil discord, and battles. Does Plato argue for abstaining from desires? Well, it seems that the body fills us with these desires. If the desires distract you from developing your logos and your understanding of the things that have real being, such as justice itself, not a just thing, but justice and being, beauty itself, goodness itself. If those are the desires that you have, then yeah. But it's not abstinence. See, the justice that Plato has is temperance, which is aligning. So we have the virtues here. Temperance, or in the Greek sophrosoon, means to align the parts of your soul. So if there are 3 parts of your soul, do we have a triad for parts of the soul? Here we go. If our soul has desires, an inwardly desiring part, and if our soul has an outwardly desiring part, something that moves you. So this desire to eat a sandwich, this desire is a desire to go out and do something in the world. And then we have another part of our soul that plans. So the idea of temperance isn't abstaining. He wrote 2,000 years ago and we still haven't learned anything. Right. Well, one of the significant problems to having not discovered it is that we only now have a good translation. And we've been looking at how, by the way, you can follow on YouTube, and I'm going to post all these videos so you can catch up so you won't miss anything. But the translation we have at the moment, and you can find a copy if you want, has certain key terms translated properly so that we can rediscover what Socrates was laying out for us. So you could say we've been on hold for a few thousand years, but now we can reawaken it, and it's important too. So the question is about if our desires limit us, what do we do with our desires? Well, the idea of temperance is if you've got these 3 parts of your soul, and inwardly desiring, you want to eat a sandwich, and outwardly desiring, you want to go and watch this video, but you've got a reasoning part that plans. Now, this reasoning part has to plan what kind of sandwich you want. It has to plan what kind of video you want to watch. But temperance is realizing that the ideal for this part of the soul is wisdom. It wants to know the truth, which from what we have here is some direct apprehension, or ousia, of the beings that exist eternally. So there is some pattern that is also the logos. So if we can have this direct apprehension of the truth of reality, and we can recognize the pattern in it, or the logos, the understandable pattern, this will allow us, so we have the direct experience of justice itself and the logos of it, we can use that as a paradigm. D-I-G-M. For everything that we do to be just. So for our planning, we use this as a paradigm. Yes, it's transcendent to the physical world. So the physical world will have a just thing, a just man, or a beautiful girl. But the thing is, if that just man dies, there's still the idea of justice. So in philosophy, we want to know what, we want to transition from the word a, or an example, or an adjective. A describes something, a just man or a beautiful person. We want to take it to a substantive. Go from a to the. What is the justice? And in Greek, we say justice self, because it has its own self-existent in the world of being. So it transcends, but it also is the cause. So it causes just things. So if suddenly lovely Sally gets into an accident and she's not as beautiful anymore, it doesn't affect the beauty itself. In philosophy, we want to experience this. And we also want to have an understanding of it and use understanding as our method so that when we do experience this, we can recognize it. And we can use it as a paradigm. Also, we want to purify ourselves from all of the false beliefs about this experience, because if you separate from your body and you were told by your parents, only the physical world exists, anything else is the devil, you might not appreciate that. You might flee from that. You might not look to understand that. So that's the two parts of philosophy. Purifying the bad mythology and the bad logos, but also developing the true logos as a method for preparing ourselves to experience that. And here in the Phaedo, he's saying, you know what gets in the way of that preparation and purification? The body, desires and stuff. So if the highest desire of this highest part of your soul, so you could say the desire is the biggest part, our belly is the biggest, and that our heart that seeks to work honorably in the world is the next biggest, and our planning is the smallest part of the soul. If we arrange it so that what we desire is what this guy wants, what we seek to honorably do is to reach what this guy wants, and this guy already wants wisdom, then every part of your soul is desiring, is seeking, and is trying to understand the same thing, wisdom. So you're unified. That's temperance. That's temperance. It's not fighting against your desire. So your desires aren't going this way and in that way, and your reasoning is saying, hey, stop it, desire. Naughty desire. Naughty, naughty, naughty. You're not doing that. You're realizing, hey, you know what? You desire good things. Yeah. Everything you desire is good, right? Sure, good sandwich. And by the way, your outward movements, you do an activity because you think you'll be made more good, right? Sure. By the way, don't you want the end of that? Don't you want the highest good? Sure. I want to do the outward activity that reaches the highest good. Good itself, or self-good. I want to desire the highest good. So you can reason with yourself, with the reasoning part of your soul, that each part of your soul should be aligned like this, like a pyramid. The ruling part should be your wisdom. And your outward and inward seeking part should also seek wisdom because it's the highest good. It's experienced as beauty itself, so it's the highest experience. It's experienced as bliss, so it's the greatest pleasure. It is the most noble activity, so it's the best thing for your outward movement. If you realize this through, not because I'm telling you, right, yes, exactly. So you could say this, your heart is your thumos, your honor, the fire in you that moves you outwardly. The virtue of your planning is the logos. direct your thumos to the logos. In fact, that's what happens in meditation. There are lots of meditative traditions that use breath work to develop an inner chi or thumos, and they try and direct it upward, up through their spine. But philosophy would say, well, that's physical. Direct it to the logos. Yeah, it's upward. In fact, this separation from the soul from the body happens upwardly. Right, you could be limited by your culture and your understanding of the good. To understand it is to die, yes, and you don't want it anymore. Exactly. So that's what we're looking for in the so how can all our desires be pure? This. Direct apprehension and understanding of the truth, because he says something very interesting. He says what we're after, let's go back a little bit. What we're after he says, look, do you think a philosophically virile person, what we would say a philosophically alpha, is interested in pleasures like eating and drinking? Simmias says to Socrates, least of all. What about sexual stimulation? No. What about other pleasures like therapy of the body? Does it seem to be held in great esteem by such a person? What about someone who traffics in buying clothes and shoes and ornaments and getting lots of sports cars? Do you think a philosopher will value or disdain them? Except as far as it's necessary? Like you don't want to walk around naked, right? You get kicked out of McDonald's. To me, it appears that a philosopher disdains these things. Does it not appear to you that the business of such a person is not concerned with the body, but they stay aloof from the body? They're not desiring those things, since they have turned around the soul. There is something about turning your soul around from your physical senses that makes you aloof from those kinds of desires. Right, well, you can find a copy of the text if you're interested in this one. That's a liberation from the soul from the body. And he says, by the way, such a person is not at all mindful of the pleasures that arise through the body. So there's something that we're after, phronesis, that can be directed to the body. There are some people who have... Oh, cool. Good for you. Reading the Conversation of Socrates. Yeah, this is a new translation that you can find down there by the Balboa. There are certain key words that will stand out as not being translated in other translations, like self. This one here is translated as mindfulness. Whenever you read mindfulness, make that a puzzle. Oh, cool. Cool, good for you. Why? Because phronesis is a kind of virtue that isn't described in the Republic, but is mentioned. And here he is saying, by the way, we can have phronesis of the body. In the Republic, he talks about how there are certain people who are very good at acquiring possessions, very good at being a salesman, very good at getting power. We say that they have a lot of phronesis, like great dictators and stuff, but they are directing it to the pleasures of the body. Thanks for dropping in. We want to direct our phronesis to the self. So this question was a good one. How do we purify our desires? Well, there is something about this liberating our soul from the body, which turns around our soul, which turns our focus. Something called phronesis, something to do with our mind. In some translations, it's defined as practical wisdom, but that doesn't do it justice. This is going to be a big question. Keep this one, because you can direct it to your body and get really good at that. Like Rasputin, who did a lot of spiritual yoga practice and developed thumos, but directed his thumos to the pleasures of the body and ran around shagging everyone. We want to direct our thumos and our phronesis to the self, because we do not comprehend truth by sight or hearing. We want our soul to grasp the truth with the logos, making the real beings clear to ourselves. We want to see the beings, not just see them, but see them clearly. Right. That thumos. So, by the way, one of our hypotheses about what phronesis is spiritual energy, ki or thumos. Put it in your hypothesis sack, take it with you. He might say more about us about phronesis that will allow us to add to our hypothesis. So, where were we? Right. Right, yes. So how do we relate others to others? Right, yes. Breath work, breath anima. Add that into your hypothesis about phronesis. Without this, the body gives us its desires and gives us war, civil discourse, and battles. So that goes into our how do we relate to others? So that's others to others. Where is it? Here. If the soul doesn't exist, war, civil discourse, and battles by acquiring possessions and riches. That's our dialectic of. So this is the negative, he's telling us. For all wars arise through the acquisitions of possessions, and it is for the sake of the body that we are compelled to acquire riches. Being enslaved, there's our metaphor, our repeating theme in the mythology. It's a good technique to communicate. If like in video games, you might pass a painting and there'll be one painting which is missing a gem in the eye of the person and it sticks out. Oh, there's something I have to do. I have to find the gem and put it in that painting eye. One way of alerting a reader to a key point is by repetition of a certain theme, and this idea of enslavement we've seen come up many, many times. So should stand out to us. We are enslaved to its care, because through and out of all of this we have no leisure for philosophy. What a disaster. But worst of all, the fact is that if there ever arises for us some rest, and we turn to some study, we get into this, everywhere in our search, it again pours in and presents itself in a clamor and pouring in. And it drives us out of our mind. I gotta eat that damn sandwich. I can't sit still anymore. So that we are not enabled by self to behold the truth. But, as it has truly been shown to us, if ever we intend to enter into a certain pure state, so again, this is what we want, this is what it is, so we can go back to our dialectic and say, what do we want? To enter a pure state. So it's already there. One must become liberated from self. We must behold the self-realities with the self-soul. So these realities that we seek in philosophy is beheld by the self-soul. And at that time, we are, as it seems likely, we shall attain to that which is our desire, and of which we claim to be lovers, of phronesis, when we are dead, as the Logos points out, but not while we live. And of course, dead has that meaning. For it is not possible to noesis, intuitively know, in a pure way with the body. When one of two results is the case, we can never know that, which is to be possessed, who, or when we are dead. For at that time the soul will be self by self, separate from the body, but not before. And while we live, as it seems likely, we shall be closest to knowing in the following way. This should stand out to us, okay? How do we become closest? Where's our sound effect for... Okay. How do we do it? In the following way. When we neither associate nor commune with the body as much as possible. Not any more than is necessary. Only the necessary sandwiches. We must not be filled with this nature. We must purify ourselves from the body until divine self should liberate us. So something else comes in and lets us in. So we are not completely the ones in charge. This is significant. Why? Let's go. So we're on page 16. Let's go back to the start. Let's go back to the start and see the mythology here. So Socrates is talking to Phaedo and say, hey, were you present with Socrates on that day? Everything as a human need is just water and potato. Right. That's all you need. Maybe something to wear as well. Water, potato, and robe. Were you there? What was the logos and how did he meet his end? Okay, so says, give us in detail what happened of his self-death, his logos and deeds. I get the greatest pleasure. So this is interesting. He's saying, I will tell you in detail what happened because I always get the greatest pleasure to remember Socrates, and by talking about self. So we talked about changing our pleasures. Could the greatest pleasure be some sort of remembering of Socrates and logosing about the self? If we were to experience this pleasure purely, would we naturally be less inclined to pursue our physical pleasures because we realize there's an even greater pleasure to be had? Okay, so I'm going to the start. Here we go. Oh, here's the good daemon, by the way. He appeared to be a good daemon in his disposition and logos, and he met his end fearlessly and nobly. It occurred to me that neither in the place of Hades where he was going would he be without divine providence, and he would also fare well. So having this divine connection and doing well, that sounds awesome. Okay, but so we're after the... Okay, here, I'll describe in detail from the beginning. This is the beginning of the mythology. We gathered at dawn at the court. What is a daemon? I never seem to get a good answer. Then you're... Good. That's good. So no one has ruined your question yet. So it can become an object of meditation for you. I'm also in that boat, by the way. I haven't got a satisfactory answer. But I wonder what sort of answer would be satisfactory. Maybe the only satisfactory answer will come from knowing the daemon directly. By the way, Socrates was described to be like a good daemon himself, so that's a good puzzle. But yes, I also share that question. Good for you. Alright, so we gathered together... We gathered together at the court in which the trial took place, for it was close to the prison. Thus we were in a habit of waiting around and how did they spend their time? Discussing things with each other until the prison should open. When it opened, we used to go into Socrates and spend most of the day with self. So we gathered together even earlier, then someone came out to let us into the prison. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, they're gathering together with his friend to remember Socrates and talk together about self and Socrates. Are we doing the same thing? Are we gathering together as regularly as we can to remember Socrates and discuss the logos of the self logos? And they're saying they did that waiting to be let in. Now, in this doctrine, he's saying, by the way, we do our best to purify ourselves from the body. How do we do that? Accurate understanding with the logos and the dialectic, separated from our senses, pulling information from this, which is remembering Socrates and learning the logos, until the divine self should liberate us. Something else greater than us lets us in. That's why those philosophers who've reached this say there is no method, because you don't do it. This is one of my favorite expressions from a philosophical text that I'm going to refer to. it's a story about someone who has had this experience of the realm of being. And he said, well, first I had it through drugs, but then I had it through dreams. But then I did it in this way through developing the logos and philosophy. But here's the thing, if you just have it through drugs, you'll think it's the drugs that did it. If you have it through dreams, then you'll always wonder, well, how come I had that experience through dreams? What made me so special? And then if you have it through the method of the logos, you'll think it's the method that was the cause of it. But it's neither of those three. When you're ripe, the fruit will drop. So in that sense, there is no method. But in another sense, plant, the body, the animal, spirit, and the rational, the mind. Interesting. The body is common to all bodies, right? So a punch can be discovered. Blaze it. Right, so these are methods in which people have had this experience. Drugs, dreams, and through some method. Now, our method is the logos, this one that they're talking about here, which is the more complete method and has a lot of benefits, especially purifying yourself from the false beliefs. A lot of traditions that don't have the logos fall down in that way. But what he's saying here is we do our best to purify ourselves from the body through the logos until the divine self should liberate us. Someone invites us in. There are a lot of mythological metaphors of that in Socrates. In the symposium, he stands on the doorway of the next door neighbor's house in contemplation. There's a whole theme of who gets invited to the party at the symposium. Anyway, keep that in mind. We'll take that with us. The divine self should... Okay, let's write that down somewhere so we've got it in case we need it. Where should we write it? Oh yeah, here we're here. Others back to self. How do we relate to philosophy? Let's make it in blue. We purify ourselves from body. Purify ourselves from body. From body until the divine self should liberate us. Self. Now, one way you could say, well, I'm not doing it. This divine self is liberating me from my ignorance and my a self-association with the body. That's the ignorant part. When we think that we are something we're not, specifically when we think we are the body. So you could say we're being liberated from our ignorance as well. Should liberate us. So the divine self is liberating us, but another way, well, it's the self. So another way, you are doing it, just not the you that you think you are. It's curious. Stand in the threshold, yes. Right. Apply to fear and anxiety. To do that, to follow the logos and stand in that threshold, to purify yourself in this way, in the face of fear and anxiety, but also pleasure and pains. That's the virtue of courage, by the way. Right, I've been using the censor. What does that mean? Using the censor. The oil frying method. What's that? You would be crispy. Poets in the city. I'm not quite following you. Can you say more? thus being purified on the one hand by having been liberated of the, here we go, there's again the phronesis of the body again. So we can have phronesis of the body. We shall be likely to, telling them to change the story. They say this is a bad and you can't. It's not. Oh. Right. This method of purification and liberating yourself from the body, often our poets demonize. And one way is to like ignore them and do it anyway. Right. It can be you can join with the divine self. That's making you God. What a heathen. And so one way is to ignore them, ignore that fear and anxiety caused by that false mythology and do it anyway. Another way is answer them. Is there a way of using the logos and the dialectic to answer them and say, well, actually, here is what you're thinking. This is why it's irrational and wrong. Purify yourself. Good point. So by having liberated from the mindfulness of the body, we shall be likely to be with such a kind. Yes, purifying with logos. And through ourselves we shall know all that is pure. Wow, come on.
Wow.
And on the other hand, this is likely to be the truth. For it is not lawful for that, again, likely. This is a likely account until you pull it off for yourself. Hypothesis. It's one of those ifs. Take it in your if sack. You have to verify it for yourself. It is not lawful for that which is not pure to attain to the pure. Such I believe this is the doctrine we have to repeat to each other. We have to keep repeating this. Keep repeating it. In fact, we've repeated it 2 read-alongs in a row. Repeat it and believe it. And at least all those who are right lovers of learning. Do you believe in this way? I most certainly do, O Socrates. Okay, lovers of learning. Okay, we've got this written down. So we had a new triad that we're hypothesizing and playing with. He says we are lovers of... Here we go. To do philosophy correctly is... Philosophy is the being. The way we do it or the power is correctly. And the activity is to desire, practice, and contact, dying and being dead. That's what we read earlier. We just made it into a triad because that's fun and helpful. He also just said, lovers of learning. So we have, also philosopher, do your life's work in a worthy way, being power and activity, but lover of learning. Because philosophy is lover of wisdom, and he said our true love is lover of phronesis. So I'm wondering if we've already written this down or not. Here we go. So he said, we repeat this to each other and believe it for all those who are right lovers of learning. So that's philomathesis. So this activity of repeating and believing this is philomathesis. He also said our goal is to reach that which we love, making us a philos phronesis. But also this whole activity and the way of being is philosophia, love of philosophy. So our question is, how would you arrange these as a triad? I think lovers of learning, because it's related to believing it and repeating this with each other, is probably the lowest. That's the activity. I am not sure whether I would put philosophy as the second term, the power, or if it's philosophy as the way of being, you're a philosopher. Because I'm wondering if philosophy is the way that you reach the state of being where you are love of phronesis. So yeah, so I'm not sure where I would put these on a triad. Which is the higher? Philosophy, love of wisdom, or philophronesis, love of that mindfulness? Math liking that. Right. Is philosophy the mechanical thing? Yeah, I don't know. So maybe philosophy is the lowest, it's the activity, it's the mechanical. And then we go through a power. So we go through philomatheus, we love learning, that helps us do the activity. And then we finally reach our love of phronesis. That's the highest virtue. Or is it the rules? Yeah, so maybe, yeah. So maybe even there's a question about here. Yeah, we don't know. That's a good question though. Because he definitely did say philomathesis, lovers of learning. All right, so we can bring in the first hypothesis. Do we have a triad for that? The one that is not even being, and not many. Do we have any triads with the first hypothesis? Oh yeah, the self triad. Here we go. The one self. Could this be philosophy? No, you see, in the Parmenides, he said, I don't want to go through my hypothesis of the one self because I'm returning to my love. I don't want to return because I know how difficult it can be. I'm like a champion racehorse who's being called to race again after retiring, but I know how difficult it is to swim through such a sea of logos. So maybe the one self isn't philosophy. Maybe philosophy is the logos. The love of learning is the state of mind, and the state of being where you are in the one self is phronesis. Maybe. The one that is not, but expresses it as potentia. It is above the non-one as unaccountable number, not one, nor non-zero. Yeah, so that's the one self. That's the first hypothesis of Parmenides. And this is the one that is, or the self that exists most purely. And then you've got the self-logos. Maybe this is the first hypothesis. Maybe this is the second. Maybe this is the third, therefore. Don't know, we haven't got to the third yet, but that's a question. Anyway, so which is philosophy, which is learning, which is philosophia, which is philomathesis, and which is philophronesis? Don't know, but we'll keep that in our sack of questions.